When we left off last week, we had just talked about how the Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress, had just sent off its official protest over the Coercive Acts, and are anxiously awaiting England's response. But in the meantime, while many in the colonies are hopeful that some sort of reconciliation can be achieved with England, a lot of people are starting to prepare for a war that they believe is inevitable at this point. So some of the preparations that these people are doing, a lot of this is focused, of course, in the Massachusetts area. This is, again, remember, this is the kind of the epicenter of our colonial protest. Within the colony of Massachusetts, a lot of people are making preparations for war. They are, despite the fact that General Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, has forbidden any kind of town meetings and has disbanded the Massachusetts colonial government, these people are still meeting in secret. Just because you tell the Massachusetts that they're not allowed to have any kind of town meetings anymore, in this case, you're almost daring them to do it. So they are going to continue to hold their town meetings. They're meeting in secret. And in these secret meetings, they have formed what they called committees of safety. The purpose of these committees is to start making material and physical preparations for a war that they believe is inevitable. Some of the things that these committees of safety are doing is they are encouraging their neighbors and the townsfolk to start stockpiling weapons. So as the underground government of Massachusetts holds these meetings, they tell these committees, go back to your towns, go back to your villages, start stockpiling materials and weapons, food, anything that you might need to sustain a militia in time of war. And regarding a militia, they also start getting these groups organized. Now it was already established for a long period of time that all adult males are obligated to serve in the colonial militia. This is just a matter of fact during this era. But for many of these men, they hadn't seen any action in a long time. A lot of people didn't know that they were in the militia, or they didn't know who their commander was in the militia, or where the militia is supposed to meet if called upon. So they're just trying to get things organized. Make sure you know where to report. Make sure you know who your commander is. Militia commanders, make sure that you know how to contact all of your men in your unit. So they're getting these things organized, and they're putting the word out that we need to be ready to go at a minute's notice. When the word comes, when this thing goes down, that's not the time to be making preparations. That's not the time to get ready. We need to be ready to go right now, so that when the word comes down, we can grab our muskets and our rucksacks and we can head out the door at a minute's notice, just like that. So this is where the nickname Minutemen comes from. This idea that they needed to be ready to go at a minute's notice because there won't be much warning. On the other side of this story, the British in the area, this General Gage, who is charged with maintaining order and discipline in the Massachusetts area, he's also making preparations. Now it was no big secret that the Massachusetts colonists were meeting in secret. They were still holding their town meetings, and these committees of safety were making preparations for war. This was no secret. General Gage had his sources of information too, and he knew that this type of thing was going on. It was his job to know these things. As a military governor of this colony, he needed to be aware of all these different situations. So he's fully informed that there is a local militia organizing and preparing for war, and if he's going to maintain order and discipline here, he needs to be able to stop this from happening. So he finds out where these weapons are being stockpiled in a small little town of Concord, Massachusetts, about 20 miles outside of Boston. So General Gage hears about this weapons cache in Concord, and he dispatches a battalion of British troops to go seize these weapons and prevent them from falling into the hands of the militia. So this is where our Battle of Lexington and Concord takes place. This is in the spring of the spring of 1775. The British troops leave Boston and they head out down the main road toward Concord. Well, it's at this point that Paul Revere and another guy named William Dawes, two men who had already been designated as the early warning alert system, they were tasked with riding down the road and warning people along the way that the British are coming. Now is the time. Today is the day. Now is the time to get ready and go. So as Revere and Dawes head out of town, riding down the roads away from Boston, heading toward Concord, they're alerting all the people along the way. Now, by the time let's go ahead and take a look at our map here. Here's Paul Revere, of course, spreading the word. The British are coming. The British are coming. Everybody get ready to go. And then taking a look at the map here, we see the British are marching down this main road from Boston. Their destination, of course, is Concord. This is where all the weapons are stored. By the time they get to the town of Lexington, Paul Revere has spread the word sufficiently to where there's a small militia force gathered here at Lexington, ready to meet the British. Now there's only about 70 militiamen gathered here in Lexington against the 700 British regular troops. The intent here is not to try and defeat the British Army. The purpose of these militia at Lexington, they know that they're outnumbered 10 to 1. But their intent here is to just slow the British down just long enough to allow the main militia force to gather at Concord, which is the more important city. So and that's what happens. A few militia members are killed and wounded here, and a few British are wounded, but it's just a small skirmish. It's over in just a couple hours on the morning of April 19th. By the time that British regiment reaches Concord later that afternoon, a much larger militia force has assembled. At this point, the Massachusetts militia outnumbers the British soldiers. So the tables are kind of turned here at Concord. Plus, the only approach into Concord is over a narrow bridge, and this entire regiment can't cross the bridge all at once. And they, of course, will be in a situation where the British commander realizes that this is not a winnable scenario. They're outnumbered and the terrain is just not suited for an attack. So the British commander will order a retreat or a withdrawal, and they will move back to Boston. Of course, the problem comes here is when they're moving back to Boston, they're traveling on the same road that they came out on. So this is later on that evening as they're traveling back to Boston. Everybody in the area, everybody in this whole area is aware of what's going on at this point. And you got more militia lined up along the road, hiding behind rocks and trees. And this is kind of where the legend of American guerrilla fighters fighting the British redcoats begins to take shape. So this stories of patriots and Minutemen fighting behind trees and rocks, shooting the British as they come down the road. By the time the British regiment gets back to Boston, they've lost about a little over 270 casualties. Not all dead, but some killed, some wounded. But over 270 casualties among the British regiment. The Americans are only going to suffer about 100 casualties, a little bit less than 100 casualties. So this first battle of Concord, and Lexington was kind of the opening shots of this battle. It's useful to think of this Lexington and Concord as kind of the same. It's all the same battle, really. So this is basically the first battle of the American Revolution, and we see it clearly is a Patriot victory. So among the Patriot militia, there's a lot of feelings of success and victory at this point. They've stood up to the British Army and they've won their first little victory here, but this is only the beginning of the story. So it's a little bit too early to start celebrating yet. When we look at here's just an illustration of Concord. Of course, this artist portraying the perspective of the Patriots here, lined up in defense of Concord and the British trying to make their way into town. Again, this is showing again how the Patriots are standing up to the British in the field for the first time. This is our first real taste of battle. Although it's small and the results are not that dramatic, it is our first taste of battle against the British Army. And so it's going to set an important precedent, and this is going to be an important factor in generating more support for the Patriot cause. So after Lexington and Concord, this is April of '75. We see that by the time our Second Continental Congress meets in May, just a month later, the situation has changed significantly. When the Continental Congress adjourned in the fall of the previous year, they decided, okay, we're waiting for England to respond to our declaration of grievances, our petition of protest, and we're just going to wait. We'll meet again in the spring, and we'll see what happens then. We'll take it from there. Now, when they adjourned that First Continental Congress, many of them were fully expecting some sort of reconciliation. But by the time they reconvene in May of '75, the situation is totally different now. Fighting has already taken place at Lexington and Concord. So when Congress reconvenes in May, they're faced with a new situation. They are no longer discussing what to do in case of war. They are now having to react to a war that has already begun. So they are in the midst of this situation. They're kind of in crisis mode in this Second Continental Congress. So their objectives now shift completely. They're no longer are they focused on seeking some sort of reconciliation or simply voicing grievances. They are now actively planning for a war that has already begun. So they're a little bit behind here, and they're trying to catch up. First order of business is that they decide to establish a Continental Army, and this is an important first step. Excuse me. If they're going to fight a war against the most powerful army in the world, then it makes sense that they too have an army as well. Remember, up to this point, colonies have relied almost exclusively on militia to fight their battles. Well, they realize that militia are not going to, despite what just happened at Lexington and Concord, everyone here in Philadelphia at this Continental Congress realizes that in a long war, the militia don't really stand much of a chance against a well-organized and professional army. So they're going to need to get organized themselves. Hence the need for this Continental Army. Now, in the initial stages of this Continental Army, it is essentially made up of former militiamen. So most of the militias in the New England area, centered around Massachusetts, these militias will make up this new Continental Army. Later on, volunteers from all the colonies will comprise this Continental Army, but initially it's just the militias of the New England area. George Washington is appointed commander-in-chief of this new Continental Army. George Washington was kind of an obvious choice. When we first met him a few years ago in the French and Indian War, he was relatively unknown outside of his own community. But at this point, Washington has a reputation as an honest and effective leader. He's well respected among the members of Congress. And while he's not a professional soldier, he seems to be the best choice to lead this new Continental Army. Also, a little kind of a biographical footnote here. George Washington was never a big fan of militia. He was a longtime student of and admirer of European militaries. He had for a long time studied their tactics and strategies and European military history. He was convinced that the only way to fight the British Army effectively is with a similar type of army. So it was his intention to turn this Continental Army from a disorganized band of misfits and militia into a professional army. So they set about the task of training and equipping this army, which, given their resources, is a little easier said than done. But Washington is determined to fight the British on their terms, in terms of the type of fighting that's going to take place. Professional armies facing each other on the field of battle. All right, while the Continental Congress is busily trying to determine how they're going to fight this war against the British, more fighting takes place in the Boston area. The Battle of Bunker Hill. This is while it's not the first battle of the Revolution, that honor goes to Lexington and Concord. This is the first major engagement where we've got large numbers of a large militia force facing off a large British army in a traditional battle. So Lexington and Concord was kind of a small scale skirmish. This is going to be a full scale battle. This is the summer of '75. This is taking place as Congress is meeting. Once Congress reconvenes in May of '75, they're going to stay in session for the next year, effectively becoming a central coordinating committee for this war effort. So the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is just outside Boston. There's we take a look at well, before we get into the battle here, a little trivial footnote for you. The battle actually takes place on Breed's Hill. We call it the Battle of Bunker Hill because of a mislabeled map that was used during the battle, and people mistakenly referred to this battle as the Battle of Bunker Hill. So this is kind of how it goes down in the history books, is as a result of this mistaken, mislabeled map. At any rate, this battle takes place on the Charlestown Peninsula. This peninsula is just north of Boston. Here you can see the northern tip of Boston here, and that's Boston Harbor, formed by the mouth of the Charles River. This hilltop here, you can see this is labeled Bunker Hill. It's actually Breed's Hill, but this is actually a reprint of the map that they used in 1775. So this hilltop is a vital position. Both the militia and the British Army want to control this hilltop because from here, cannons can effectively cover the entire area of Boston Harbor. Whoever controls this hilltop can control Boston Harbor, which at this point is an important port city, and it's also the headquarters of the British Army here in Massachusetts. So this is a vital piece of real estate. Once General Gage realizes that the Massachusetts militia has formed has surrounded the area, the Boston area, Gage wants to go ahead and take control of this high ground in order to defend the harbor. Unfortunately for him, the Massachusetts militia has already moved into position here, so now Gage has to drive them off, which is going to be a little bit easier said than done. When we talk about this battle here, we've got essentially about 2,200 British soldiers are going to face off against about 1,700 Massachusetts militia. Now, keep in mind this is the Massachusetts militia, and they've at this point the word has spread, and militias from surrounding areas, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York have all started filtering in to join up with the Massachusetts militia. So we've got a lot larger force than we had at Concord. So 1,700 men from the militia on the top of the hill, 2,200 British soldiers attempting to drive them off. Now, despite the disadvantages that we've talked about and inherent to militia forces, and the obvious advantages of a larger, more well-equipped British Army here, the British Army is going to struggle almost to the point of disaster to win this battle. Taking a look at some illustrations here to kind of clue you in. Our colonial militia on the top of Bunker Hill. The artist has portrayed them in a way that we can kind of tell a lot about this group just from looking at this picture. We can see here that they are not professional soldiers. They're all dressed in civilian clothes. Again, an indication of the fact that these men are just regular citizens. They all have regular jobs: farmers, merchants, traders, craftsmen, and so on and so forth. These are not professional soldiers. But some of them, this is the first time they've ever seen any kind of battle at all. They've not had any kind of training. Even their leaders, these gentlemen on top of the hill here, prominent members of the community who are now serving as officers in this militia. We can tell just from the way that they're standing and positioned here that these are not very well trained or disciplined men. Everyone's holding their weapon differently. Some appear to be ready. Some appear to be just kind of standing around. Organization and discipline are not something that you would think of when you look at this portrayal of the militia. Charging up from the bottom of the hill, we have British soldiers who, as this artist has portrayed, they appear to be much more well organized. They're marching in ranks. There's flags and officers giving signals and commands. There's a drummer beating out a cadence to keep the men moving forward in unison. So they appear to be a lot more organized in this battle. But the way the battle is going to play out is that as the fighting begins, the British are having to fight uphill, and this is in the realm of military science. Without turning this into a military science class, it's always much more difficult to fight uphill against an enemy that has a hilltop advantage. It's a strategic or tactical challenge. So despite the fact that the militia are not as well trained or equipped, they're going to hold their own against this superior British force. Over the course of this day, the British soldiers will make 3 separate attempts to attack this position on top of the hill, and each time the colonial militia will push them back down the hill. The British Army is going to suffer significant casualties here. More than 1,000 British soldiers are going to be killed or wounded during this battle, whereas only about 400 of the Americans will be killed and wounded. So we see here that the British are going to pay a heavy price as they attack this hill. In the end, though, the British will win this. They'll be victorious in this battle of Bunker Hill. Not because they were fighting any better or because they were more determined, but essentially the colonial militia ends up just withdrawing from the hill because they were running out of ammunition. They just simply did not have the resources to continue fighting. They were inflicting much heavier casualties on the British. Had they had enough ammo, they probably could have fought on and maybe even won the battle. But again, this is another testament of how ineffective, one of the big disadvantages of the militia. Their lack of resources prevented them from continuing the fight. They just did not have the resources they needed to continue fighting. So this will go down in the history books as a British victory, but it wasn't due to any kind of a failure on the part of the militia, just a lack of resources. So the militia will withdraw to the outskirts of Boston and of course be reinforced by other militia groups. The city of Boston will be effectively surrounded by militia while the fighting for the meantime is kind of over. Eventually the British will be forced to withdraw out of Boston in the spring of 1776. So for about the next 8 months to a year, the militia will be fighting this skirmish in and around the city of Boston and eventually drive the British out. But while it's a victory in the local context, the war is just beginning at this point. So it's really too early for the militia to start celebrating, even though they drove the British out within the next year or so. Back in Philadelphia, our Continental Congress is faced with a new challenge at this point. There are still some in Congress who believe that reconciliation is possible, and they are pursuing that. But a lot of people feel at this point that that the war has already begun, and there's no sense trying to avoid a war when it's already started. So Congress feels compelled to send one last attempt to reach out to England. This olive branch petition, and this is in the summer of 75. They draft this petition and send it to Parliament. Basically, of course, they're appealing to the king as well here. Basically, this is an acknowledgement of what has happened. It's like, dear King George, we realize that there's a lot of things have happened in the recent months. There's a lot of situation has become very intense. Fighting has broken out. Men have been killed. However, we believe that it is still possible to to step back from this situation and find a more peaceful alternative or solution to this issue. Now, most of the people in Philadelphia in this Continental Congress at this point, in the summer of 75, most of them believe that this gesture is almost pointless because the war has essentially already begun. But they still feel they have a moral obligation to try and avoid further conflict. So that's the reason for this olive branch petition. In the end, of course, King George will completely reject this. By the time this olive branch petition gets to the king's desk, he has already declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, and Parliament and the rest of the English government, they are actively preparing for war. So the war has begun in earnest at this point, and this olive branch petition is just kind of a gesture, again, trying to fulfill some sort of moral obligation to peace. At the same time this is all going on, in the various houses of government throughout the colonies, there's an ongoing campaign to generate support for the Patriot cause. While the Congress is meeting in Philadelphia to discuss plans of action and how they're going to deal with the situation, back in the individual colonies' governments, there's a strong effort to try and tip the scales of support in favor of the Patriot cause. Because at this point, in the summer of 75, a lot of people are unsure whether or not war is the answer. So the majority of colonists would like to avoid war, and they're not really sure they want to support the Patriot cause. So one good example is Patrick Henry, and Patrick Henry is, of course, one of our famous founders. He's a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. So while these battles are going on during the summer of 75, and Congress is trying to reach out to the British government, Patrick Henry and others like him are speaking before their houses of government, promoting the Patriot cause. Henry says to the Virginia House of Burgesses that, and this is his famous Liberty or Death speech, he's trying to generate support for an independence movement. He's not just talking about resisting English oppression and trying to work within the system. He's advocating independence at this point, and some of the more radical Patriot supporters are talking along these lines. Of course, in his quote from his speech, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And these are bold words, very dramatic, very, very passionate. Clearly, Henry is a strong supporter of independence, and there are many others like him. While they are kind of a minority at this point, their numbers are growing in strength due largely to the efforts of Henry and others like him who are speaking and advocating for the Patriot cause. Another individual is a guy named Thomas Paine. And this is in January of 76. Thomas Paine is going to publish a pamphlet, an essay entitled Common Sense. And in this essay, Thomas Paine is openly advocating for independence. He's not just criticizing British taxes or British laws. He's advocating for independence. He says the American colonies should be independent. It makes no sense for an entire continent to be ruled by a tiny island. He openly criticizes the king and Parliament. He condemns the whole idea of monarchies. He said the whole institution is outdated and needs to be done away with. So these are bold words that Paine is speaking in this essay. He basically, the bottom line of his conclusion here in his essay is that America should be independent because the British government had failed to keep its end of the contract. And he's referring specifically here to John Locke's contract theory of government. The British government has failed us, he said. They have failed to uphold their part of the contract, which is to protect the rights of the citizens. Since they failed to do this, we have no choice but to seek independence and create a new government that will protect our rights. So again, this is a bold statement of support for independence and liberty from England. He's advocating a Republican-style government. This essay, Common Sense, is one of the first coherent statements of Enlightenment philosophy to be produced in America. And like I said, it echoes a lot of what we already talked about with John Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers. By the results of people like Patrick Henry making impassioned speeches advocating for independence, and essays like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which will be widely circulated throughout the colonies. When it was published in January of '76, about 150,000 copies were sold throughout the colonies. So by the time we get to the summer of '76, most of the people in the colonies have read this or are at least familiar with this essay. And we see significant number of people joining the Patriot cause in support of independence. So by the time we get to the summer, to July of '76, we see a majority of colonists supporting this idea of independence. Now, not all of them are flocking to join the Continental Army, but there is a lot of widespread support for the idea of independence. So in the summer of '76, the Continental Congress will propose that they declare independence from England, and this was initiated by a guy named Richard Henry Lee, as one of the delegates from Virginia. He introduces a motion or resolution in Congress that the colonies should immediately seek independence from England, and the Congress appoints a committee to do this. Basically, the committee includes Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and a few other men form this committee to draft a declaration. Now, while Thomas Jefferson worked as part of this committee, most of what we read in the Declaration of Independence are the words of Thomas Jefferson. He kind of took the lead here. Jefferson was a student of the Enlightenment. He had read Locke and he had read other Enlightenment philosophers. So Jefferson's draft of this Declaration of Independence is very heavily influenced by Enlightenment philosophy. In fact, in many cases, the words of the Declaration of Independence almost read like a quote of John Locke. Things like natural rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all those things very similar to Locke's own words as he wrote about Republican government. This Declaration of Independence is also considered to be one of the first important statements of American Enlightenment philosophy. So we are taking those ideas from the Enlightenment and we are now putting them into use. We're testing the water. We're going to see, okay, we're going to see if we can hold government accountable for its part of the contract. And that's what this Declaration of Independence is saying. It reads kind of like an essay outlining not only our grievances against England for having failed to uphold its part of the contract, but it outlines our belief in this idea of republican government and the responsibilities of that type of government to protect the rights of its citizens. So the Declaration of Independence is not just a, hey, England, we don't want to be part of you anymore, we want to quit. This is a very coherent statement of our philosophy on government and the role that it should play in society. And this is going to serve as kind of the cornerstone of our government once we are independent and we start setting about the task of creating a new government. This Declaration of Independence kind of gives us an idea of what direction that we want to head in. Here, of course, is an artist's portrayal of this pivotal moment in our story. The first major turning point in our story here in the creation of the United States is this Declaration of Independence. Here in July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress signing this declaration, indicating their intent to break away from England officially and form their own nation. Now, this is kind of a big deal because at this moment, they are all still considered to be British subjects. And what they're doing, this open declaration or defying the open defiance of the British government, will be considered a crime. And if America loses the revolution, then these men could be tried as criminals, perhaps even executed. So they're taking a huge risk here in terms of their future, which is at this point very uncertain. They want independence. They've just declared independence, but wanting it and declaring it and actually achieving it are separate matters entirely. So there's a long road ahead of them. Another little piece of trivia for you here. The Continental Congress voted for independence on July the 2nd. So technically, American independence was declared on July the 2nd. But by the time the document was drafted and signed by all the delegates, it was July the 4th was when it was became official. So just a little piece of trivia for you there. So now the war is on. It's official now. It's not just something that's happening that we're reacting to. The war is official. We have declared our independence, and we are now fighting a war to ensure or secure that independence. So the process has begun officially. Now, even though technically the revolution doesn't begin until we declare independence in July of '76, as we've already discussed, the fighting has already taken place. The reality of things is that the war has already begun by the time we declare independence. So now that the war is official, it's useful at this point to take a look at some of our advantages and disadvantages. And this is what we're doing here in this discussion. You're taking inventory of our advantages and disadvantages. This is exactly what Congress was doing in the summer of '76. They were taking inventory of their advantages. All right, we just basically declared war against the most powerful nation in the world. Now we have to set about the task of actually fighting this war. What are our advantages? What do we got going for us? What are our liabilities? What are the things going against us here? So this is exactly what they're doing, and they're looking at a lot of the things that we're going to talk about here, namely, how are we going to fight this large professional army, the most powerful army the world has ever seen? How are we going to fight them with militia troops and no resources and no money and no allies? We got a lot of disadvantage. When you look at this list, if you wrote it all down, the outlook looks pretty grim for the American patriots, because we have very few advantages. We don't have a navy at all. England has a powerful navy. They can use that navy to blockade our ports to prevent us from receiving any resupplies. With this navy, they can also reinforce their troops. They can resupply their troops, and they can do this every day. They have so many ships and a well-established navy with supply lines that they could go on doing this for a long time, whereas we have no capacity to resist this naval force. But we just don't really have the resources. While the Continental Congress did authorize the creation of a navy, when they created the Continental Army, they also signed a bill authorizing the creation of a navy, but it's just a piece of paper that says Navy on it. We have no actual navy at this point. They just authorized the creation of one. By the end of the war, we'll have a few ships. We'll be able to muster up a few ships, most of them privateers, tasked with harassing British merchant ships. But we don't really have any kind of navy to resist the British Navy, so that's a big disadvantage for us. We have very few resources. America is not a manufacturer of things. We have a few small cottage industries and workshops, but not nearly enough to supply our army with the resources that it needs to fight a long campaign. So we're struggling to provide for this army that we just created. One of the big things that's a disadvantage for us is that especially in the early years of this war, we are relying on militia to do all our fighting. And we've already talked about how unreliable militia is. They're untrained, they're undisciplined, they're ill-equipped, and they're not very well organized. So this puts us at a disadvantage from day one. Despite our modest victories in those first few skirmishes, the militia will prove this disadvantage more than a few times over the course of the war. The British will win many victories as a result of our lack of resources and lack of preparedness. So militia puts us at a disadvantage here. This is the reason why George Washington and others were so determined to create a professional army of trained soldiers, trained professionals. So again, this is kind of a disadvantage for us. One another big disadvantage that we have is that we don't have any allies at all. England is a well-established nation. They've got allies in Europe. The Germans, various German kingdoms and principalities are allied with England. The Dutch are allied with England. We have no allies. The Indians here in the colonies, the majority of the Indians actually side with the British in this revolution, which sounds kind of surprising. But when you think about it, the British have promised the Indians that if they win, they will prevent any of these American settlers from moving west into Indian territory. And we have already made our intentions clear. We want to move into the Western territories and settle new lands. So from the Indians' perspective, it looks like they'll get a better deal from the British than they will from us. So a lot of the Indians will side with the British. So we essentially are on our own here. We have no allies, no one to support us, no one we can turn to for help. We are in this all on our own. And that puts us at an extreme disadvantage, especially when you look at the fact that England can draw on so many other allies. But when you look at this list of disadvantages, you might think all hope is lost, but we've got some important things going for us too that the British are just not able to match. First and foremost, we have the home court advantage. We're fighting in our own backyard for our own property, our own land. We know the neighborhood. We know the back roads and side roads. We know the best river crossings. We know where the people who are supportive of the Patriot cause, we know where those farms are and they can supply our troops. We know where the pockets of loyalist British supporters are and how to avoid them. We know where the British are going to come from. We know where they're headed to. This knowledge of the area gives us a significant advantage in terms of tactics and strategy. We can pick what battles to fight, when we want to fight. We can fight when we have an advantage, and we can withdraw when we don't have an advantage. And this is something that the British are going to struggle with throughout the war, because most of the troops that are coming here to fight from England, they are unfamiliar with the colonies. They've not been stationed here. There's relatively, compared to the numbers of troops that are going to fight here, there's relatively few of them are stationed here prior to the fact. So our knowledge of the area gives us a big advantage. The fact that our army has no supplies and no resources means that they don't have that much to carry. So whereas the British have these long supply lines and wagons and so forth carrying all their heavy supplies and equipment, the American army has nothing. So when it comes time to move, we can pack up and move fairly quickly and easily without being encumbered by a lot of supplies. So there, a disadvantage is a kind of an advantage in some situations. If we have to move quickly, we can do so without leaving behind all of our equipment. Another advantage that we're going to have is that, and this is kind of the home court advantage again. The British are faced with the burden of conquest, which means that whatever they're going to do, whatever they're going to bring with them, has to be done long distance. So although we have few resources, all of our resources are right here with us, easy to get a hold of, easy to access. Whatever England is going to use to fight this war, they must import it from England. It takes time and it's a lot of effort. It takes a lot of resources to move all that equipment. And of course, every time they capture a city or a territory, they've got to leave troops behind to guard that territory, which ends up spreading their forces thinner and thinner. So this burden of conquest is going to put England at kind of a disadvantage and kind of give us an advantage. Probably the most significant advantage that we have is our determination. We are fighting for our homes, our farms, our lands. We're fighting for freedom. Now, while England never intended to wipe us out, it was never the goal of England to destroy the colonies, to destroy America, because they depend on these colonies for trade. So that was not their intent. But from the American perspective, many people are going to view this fight as a struggle for survival. The British are sent here to kill us. Remember the propaganda value of the Boston Massacre, and how a lot of people had in their minds that the British came here to destroy us. So we're not just fighting for some abstract idea of government and republicanism. We're fighting for our lives. We're fighting to protect our families from an aggressive invader. And this is a powerful motivator. A lot of people are going to fight in a much more determined way because of this motivation. When you compare that to the British troops that are sent here to fight, their hearts just aren't in it. Most of these men, these soldiers coming from England, their homes and their families are back in England. And they're here on foreign shores in the colonies, away from home. Win or lose, the outcome of this war is not really going to have that much of an impact on those individual British soldiers. They were sent here to fight under orders, and they don't have a personal stake in this fight. While many of those British soldiers are undoubtedly patriotic, fighting for the glory of king and country, they have no personal stake in this war. Whereas the Americans fighting on the Patriot side, they are very personally invested in the outcome. They stand to lose everything if they lose, and they have a lot to gain if they win. So the motivation here is a big factor, and that's one of the probably the biggest mistake that England makes here is underestimating this determination of the Americans and their unity. We'll get a little bit more into that here in a minute. But when the British begin fighting this war, when they start deploying their troops here and they begin making their battle plans, all of their plans are based on 3 assumptions. And these are 3 basic assumptions that are based on their experience fighting other European nations in Europe. So it's not that they're ignorant or stupid, it's just that these assumptions are based on their experiences, their previous experiences, which were totally different than the experience here in the colonies. Life here in the colonies is not like life in Europe. It's a totally different environment, totally different dynamic in terms of the way people think and the way people act. The first big assumption is that in European military tradition, the best way to defeat your enemy is to capture his capital city and his port cities. So the port cities and capital cities are the targets of priority. If you can capture the major ports and the capital city, then you win. And that's just as simple as that. If you're attacking France, you're going to go straight for Paris. And once you capture Paris, the war is over because you've captured the enemy's capital city. So England is going to try to apply this theory to their campaign here in the colonies. This illustration here is a good example of that. British capture New York City in the fall of 1776, and this is right in the opening months of the war. So very early on, we see the British employing this strategy, capturing the big cities in an attempt to bring a speedy end to the war. And this artist, of course, in his very dramatic portrayal of the British capture of New York, with the British troops beating people in the streets here and the city on fire and so forth. And while the British did effectively capture New York City was not our capital. We have no capital. We got 13 colonies. Each has important cities in each colony. New York and Baltimore and Boston and Philadelphia and Charleston are all important port cities, but none of them are a central capital. So New York is no more important than any other port city in the colonies. So just because the British captured New York, that doesn't mean that all is lost for us. Since we don't have any kind of central government in the colonies, there is no capital city to be threatened. So this is an assumption based on what works in Europe. It doesn't work here because it's just not the same situation. Second big assumption that England makes is that colonial militia are no match for British regular troops, and it's just going to be an easy victory. Now, we can't really fault them for this assumption because there's a lot of evidence, there's mountains of evidence to support this idea that militia are ineffective against British troops or regular army troops. We've seen that time and again, and that plays out the way in the Revolution as well. Most of the time we see militia going up against regular troops, it doesn't end well for the militia. They were notorious for retreating very early on in these battles, and the British were able to win. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to bring victory in the whole war. An easy victory on the battlefield doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a total victory in the war. Remember, we have the advantage of retreating when it suits us and fighting when we feel we have the advantage. And we're going to apply that very consistently throughout the war. And that's going to frustrate the British attempt to gain a decisive victory in the war based on victory on the battlefield. So again, this is an assumption based on European strategies that just don't really apply here. They also believe that any kind of victory on the battlefield will translate into victory in war, and like we just said, that's just not the case here in the colonies. In all these cases, though, our determination is what's going to give us the advantage. It's what's going to turn around some of these battles. We're going to turn disadvantage into advantage by way of our determination and our unity. This is where unity comes into play. England looked at the colonies as 13 separate entities, 13 separate ways of doing things, and they didn't really recognize the fact that the colonies had become very unified over the past few years, and this unity is what's going to enable us to stand up against England, whereas individually, no one single colony was able to stand up to England by themselves. But together, and this kind of harkens back to Ben Franklin's speech at the Albany Conference in '54. Together, we will be victorious. United we stand, divided we fall. And this idea of unity is really going to come into play here with this Patriot cause. England never really is able to get their minds around this fact that we are more unified than they thought us to be. And that's what's going to give us the ultimate advantage here. People who are fighting to defend their lives and their homes are always more determined than those who were sent there to take those homes and lives. So this is what's going to really be our big advantage here, is our determination and our unity. One final advantage that England believed that they had, and this was another kind of an overestimation of their advantage here, was the presence of loyalists in the colonies. A lot of people in the colonies wanted to remain loyal to England, despite the fact that by the summer of '76 there was widespread support for the Patriot movement. There was quite a few people, a significant percentage of the population, wished to remain loyal to England. They called themselves loyalists. Tories is another example, another word that we use to describe the loyalists. If you see these two words in your textbook or in your research, they are one and the same. We talked about how a lot of Native Americans will remain loyal to England, or they'll at least be more sympathetic to England through the course of this war. But when we think about the loyalists, especially when we look at the breakdown, about 25 to 30% of the colonists were loyalists, either openly declared or undeclared, but they felt loyal to England. About 25 to 30% were fervent supporters of the Patriot cause. But about 40 to 50% were undecided. A lot of people were still on the fence. A lot of people thought that the idea of independence was a good idea, but the reality of trying to make it happen was more effort than they wanted to put into it, and they were not willing to commit to the cause. So about 40 to 50% of the population are just uncommitted to either side. And we got about 25 to 30% on either side of the loyalists and the patriots. Now these numbers will change as the war goes on. We'll see people who were previously undecided beginning to join the patriot cause. We'll even see some loyalists start to switch sides and join the patriot cause later on in the war, and we'll talk about reasons why once we get into some of the key battles. But taking a look at some images here, this map is a good illustration of the location of the loyalists versus patriots. Where this map shows where most of the loyalists are located. This is in the blue shade here, and of course where most of the patriots were located. And we even see some areas where it was kind of a mix of both, where they're going to be kind of contested territories. Now looking at this map, we see judging from the location of most of the loyalists, we see here in all these port cities, almost without exception, are strong pockets of loyalists. Judging from that, we can make some conclusions about what types of people the loyalists are, and what motivated them to stay loyal to England. When we think about these port cities, there's a lot of economic activity going on here, particularly in the area of commerce and trade. So if most of the loyalists are living in these urban areas around the port cities, we know there's a lot of merchants and traders there. A lot of these people make their money. They make their living trading with England. So these merchants and traders in these port cities, they have a very vested interest in a positive relationship with England. War with England would mean they're going to lose a lot of business and maybe even go out of business. So they are motivated by economics to stay loyal to England. They have they depend on that relationship with England. We look at another group of people that are prominent in these port cities, these major cities, are colonial officials. Not just the politicians, the colonial governors, most of whom are appointed by the king and the judges, but all the people that work for the colonial government, the clerks and the customs inspectors and the tax collectors. A lot of these people are employees of the colonial government. So just like the merchants, their livelihood, their careers are tied very closely to a relationship with England. And a war with England would put their careers and their livelihoods in jeopardy. So these two groups of people in particular are going to comprise a large number of the loyalists. And we find another group of people, and this is not widely discussed, but it's part of the story. These port cities are also points of entry for immigrants, people coming into the colonies from Europe, primarily England. Recent arrivals into the colonies, people who have just arrived in the past year or two, are very likely to stay loyal to England because they are unfamiliar with a lot of the issues that have generated this patriot movement for independence. They just can't identify with some of those issues and those problems, the protests and so forth. So these new arrivals, they have closer cultural ties with England. They still consider themselves Englishmen because they just came from England. A lot of the people in the Patriot movement, they are second and third generation colonists. They've grown up and spent their whole lives here in the colonies. They think of themselves more as American than they do as Englishmen. So there's a cultural disconnect there too. These recent immigrants are going to want to stay loyal to England because they just can't identify with the Patriot cause. So again, looking at geography here can clue us into a lot of details that are not really obvious just from looking at the map. These contested areas, these are kind of the anomalies. These are going to be areas where there's a relatively equal number of patriots and loyalists. At New Jersey is almost completely balanced between the two, patriots and loyalists. Up here in the Vermont area and the Carolina backcountry, this is probably the most the largest territory where we see patriot and loyalists are going to be competing for control in that area. And this is for a variety of reasons. A lot of people, these Carolina and the Carolina backcountry, a lot of these planters, they had trade relationships with England in terms of their crops. The only people they sold their crops to, things like rice and cotton and so forth. England is the sole purchaser of those things. So a lot of these backcountry farmers, they can't risk a war because they will lose their only source of income. And again, not all these backcountry farmers were selling cotton to England, so a lot of them will want to stay loyal to the Patriot cause as well. What's interesting to note here is that, especially in the Carolinas, we're going to see a lot of fighting between loyalist militias and Patriot militias. In some cases, there won't be any Continental Army soldiers or any British soldiers anywhere near these battles. It'll just be fighting, but kind of almost like a miniature civil war within a revolution. So we've got the 13 colonies fighting a revolution against England, but here within this small pocket inside these 13 colonies, we have neighbors fighting against neighbors in terms of whose side they want to support more. So it's kind of an interesting situation going on here in the Carolinas. In the latter part of the war, England will try to capitalize on the Loyalist support in the Carolinas, but their tactics and strategies and their overestimation of this support of the Loyalists proved to be their undoing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into some of the key battles. So Loyalists were in kind of a tough spot, especially if you're a Loyalist living in an area that's predominantly Patriot. You probably would do well to keep your mouth shut, because there was a lot of anger and animosity directed toward these Loyalists. A lot of the Patriots saw them as betrayers or traitors. They said, how can you live here in these colonies and still love England? So these Loyalists would become the targets of persecution and ridicule, sometimes violence. As we see in this illustration here, this is no town in particular, no individual in particular here. This guy is just a Loyalist, a supporter of England, living in a Patriot community. And of course they discovered him, and they're gonna, what we're looking at here is they are running him out of town on a rail, as kind of the expression goes. The rail, of course, is just this wooden beam, like the wooden rail fence you see around a lot of farmland and pastures. So they're running him out of town on a rail. They're going to prop him up on this wooden beam, and they're going to parade him out of town. People, of course, are going to be shouting insults and humiliating him and throwing rotten fruit at him and so on and so forth. The purpose of this is public humiliation. They're not trying to hurt him. That's not their goal. Now there's probably going to be an ass whooping involved here. They're probably going to beat him up and slap him around a little bit, but they're not trying to injure him or kill him. They just want to publicly humiliate him. Of course, while this group is running him out of town, there's another group back at his house tearing the place apart and looting all of his possessions. But in some cases, the violence was quite a bit more extreme. Here we see a group of Patriot supporters tarring and feathering a Loyalist. Now this was kind of this was almost medieval in terms of its brutality. Basically, they strip the guy down naked, and they pour boiling hot tar all over his body. And if you're not familiar with tar, basically it's like it's the stuff that the main ingredient in asphalt. It's real gooey and really sticky. And for it to be in a liquid state, so you could pour it, it has to be heated up to boiling. So they pour this boiling hot, sticky liquid all over the person's body. It sticks to them immediately, and of course, it's boiling, so it's burning them severely. They're going to end up with third-degree burns all over their body. And you can't just wash it off. This tar is going to stick like glue. If you try to peel it off or tear it off, it's gonna take the skin with it. So you're in a situation where there's a good chance you're not going to survive this procedure here. And of course, they cover them with feathers as kind of to add humiliation or insult to injury here. But this is brutal. This is absolutely brutal. A lot of people are going to die from this. Not everyone. It's not necessarily fatal, but it can be. And people will bear these scars the rest of their life. It's going to take a while to get this tar off, and when you do, it's going to leave scars behind. This is very brutal punishment, and there was no trial here. They found out this guy, one of their neighbors, was a Loyalist, a supporter of England, so they dragged him out of his house and they stripped him down and they tortured him arbitrarily. So this is not what you might call a just or fair situation. And keep in mind, these patriots, they are supposedly advocating for liberty and equality and justice, yet this doesn't seem to be very just the way they're treating this guy. And his only real crime here is that he had a difference of opinion regarding politics. In some cases, we'll see more brutality. Some cases, they won't even bother torturing the guy. They'll just drag him out of his house and hang him. Completely arbitrary execution, no trial, no charges. Simply because that guy had a different political view than they did. So, I make this to emphasize the point that while when we speak of the revolution, we tend to focus on the lofty ideals of liberty and freedom and republican government, and but some people are motivated more by their violence and their hate of their neighbor, more so than any kind of political ideology. So we see there's a mix of people. On the Patriot side, there's people joining the cause for a variety of reasons. These guys don't seem to be too concerned with liberty and justice. They seem to be more concerned with torturing their neighbor. Of course, if you go to the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress is meeting, their focus is on more idealistic aspects of independence, the freedom to elect a government and to be ruled fairly and justly by that government. So we got a variety of reasons motivating people here. One final piece regarding loyalists. There was an ongoing attempt by the British government throughout the war to try and undermine the colonial economy by offering freedom to runaway slaves. And this is an example of basically a pass that was issued to slaves who had run away from colonial plantations to join the British cause. Basically, the offers went that if you're a slave on a Patriot plantation and you can run away and escape to the British lines, the British Army would give you freedom and a pass. Basically, you were a free person as long as you supported the British cause. As long as you were loyal to the British cause, then you would have your freedom. And this example is dated 1783, so this is in the last year of the war. But this was an ongoing offer by the British military to slaves in the colony. Of course, we don't see large numbers of slaves taking advantage of this. Some do, and some get their freedom. But the Patriot Army, the Continental Army, had a similar offer. Any slave who fights with the Continental Army after so long will be awarded their freedom. So the fact that both sides were offering this means that it kind of canceled each other out, kind of balanced each other out there. But the intent here was to try and undermine the colonial economy. England felt if they could draw enough slaves away from the plantations, then they'd be able to have an impact on the colonial economy. That's really all we have to discuss for today. When we come back next time, we'll pick it up with some of the major campaigns of the war and some of the key battles. We're not going to talk about every battle. Obviously, that could go on forever, but we will highlight a few key battles that are turning points in the war, and we'll talk about the immediate aftermath and how peace is once again established between America and England. So we'll see you next time.